Hello again, everyone. I'm Ed Mullins. Welcome to Inside Blue. With me today is Joe Murray and Joe Amsel. This is going to be the battle of the Joes, I guess. Yeah. Both are attorneys. Joe Amsel is a former DA with the Queens District Attorney's Office, worked the appellate division. Our topic, once again, is law enforcement and social distance enforcement. It's being really shoveled out from the mayor's office down through the rank and file to the police officer in the street. As many of you know, the rank and file police officer does not want to participate in social distance enforcement or in enforcement of protest. The belief in law enforcement is that we are violating the rights of the public to which we serve. This is creating a division between the communities and the police. So that being said, you know that Joe Murray has a lawsuit that's in place. He's filed on behalf of a strip club. And Joe Amsel is now filed a lawsuit on behalf of a protest at City Hall Park in violation of the First Amendment Constitution. So, Joe, I'm going to defer to you right now and tell us about this lawsuit and what is actually happening and how did the NYPD violate their rights.
Sure. First off, thanks for having me.
Happy you made it.
I really appreciate it. This case is a case on May 9th, 2020, Saturday afternoon, about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. My clients and about 20 or so other individuals showed up in City Hall Park to exercise their First Amendment right. The First Amendment rights to free speech, First Amendment rights to freedom of assembly, First Amendment right to freedom of association, and also the First Amendment right to petition their government for redress of grievances. I mean, those are all protected rights in the First Amendment. It's right there. And they show up at the park. You know, one of my clients is holding an American flag. The other client's wearing a cap, USA on it. I mean, you have a bunch of about 15 or 20 like-minded Americans who really think that the mayor has gone overboard with this. The governor has gone overboard with this. You know, you had some of those other social distancing arrests that really went south a couple of days earlier, about on May 4th, May 5th or so. And I think that was kind of the impetus behind the protest. They show up at the park right in front of City Hall, the seat of New York City government, and you know they're just holding flags. They're all maintaining social distancing. It's a big park. You've got about 15, 20 other people walking through the park. You've got people walking their dogs, people hanging out, by a nearby fountain, all kind of minding their own business. These guys are holding signs. We're not talking Occupy Wall Street kind of. Nobody's destroying any public property. Nobody's, defecating on police cars. I mean, this is just a bunch of Americans who feel that their government has gone overboard. And whether you think or whether you agree with them or not, the orthodoxy in this country has always been that I can disagree with you vigorously, but I will fight to the death for your right to say what you believe. And that has always been the orthodoxy in this country. That's why we had Nazis marching at Skokie, and that's why we've had so many people, minorities, who have been allowed to, exercise their First Amendment right, and that has been why we are what we are as a country over the years. So these guys are there. They're there for about 30 minutes or so, and then the cops show up. You got folks from the SRG unit, SRG 1, you've got folks from the local precinct, the 7th precinct. There was a captain on scene, multiple sergeants, and about 15 or 20, 25 officers. The SRG guys come with the strategic response group guys come with their, the zip ties, and they came ready to quell this protest. Right before they moved in on the crowd, they pulled out one of these speakers and they played an audio recording. And I've got video. There's tons of video floating around the internet of this, with a pre-recorded message saying, this is the New York City Police Department. This gathering is a non-essential gathering that has been prohibited by the governor and the mayor. We order you to disperse. If you don't disperse, you're going to be subject to arrest. I mean,
just make the significance of that.
I mean, because. Yeah, absolutely, Joe. I mean, imagine in the United States of America, you've got the government playing a pre-recorded. It means that they came prepared for this.
Yes.
A pre-recorded message saying this is a non-essential gathering. Now, think about how value-laden that statement is. I mean, that essentially is the government telling the American people, New Yorkers, just like you and I, that this gathering, that whether you agree with them or not, that this gathering, this assembly, this exercise of core, protected First Amendment political speech is non-essential. I mean, think about that. Non-essential. Now, mind you, my client, one of them is wearing a mask. They're all maintaining social distancing. They're not next to each other. They're not on top of each other. I mean, there weren't even enough people, considering the size of the crowd, to be on top of each other. And the cops move in. They walk over to one of my clients. And, as we write in our complaint, the cop says, put your hands behind your back. He complies. But he goes, officer, what have I done wrong? I'm exercising my First Amendment rights to freedom of assembly. What crime have I committed? And the answer was, put your hands behind your back.
Yeah.
And I mean, when we're seeing that in America, that's a problem. And that's why we brought this case.
Well, the counter argument to that would be that we have an executive order that prohibits it for the purpose of saving lives as related to this pandemic virus. And what do we have, about 20 protesters?
About, yeah.
So the treatment of 20 protesters under these circumstances that could go to 1,000 protesters, say the next day, where you can't really stay within a 6-foot distance, then becomes a little imbalanced. And if the goal is to protect lives based on a virus, why is the mayor so wrong?
Because here's the thing. First off, you're absolutely right. I mean, there could be a snowball effect. And this is the core point here. Nobody is contesting that the government has an interest in trying to protect lives. I mean, first and foremost, the purpose of government, going back to John Locke and before, the purpose of government is to protect the public. That's why we enter into the social compact. That's why we have all decided to live under a law and under our Constitution. So the purpose of government, of course, is to protect the public. But on the other hand, there are also countervailing balances that need to be struck. And if you look at the way the Supreme Court has always analyzed these issues, the Supreme Court has always analyzed and has always tried to grapple with precisely the kind of balance that you're talking about. And the way the Supreme Court kind of looks at it, they apply a test that's called strict scrutiny. And they apply this test in very rare circumstances only when you are dealing with constitutional rights of the highest order. That is fundamental rights. And it goes back to a case called Palco versus Connecticut. And at the end of the day, they look at fundamental rights. And as a practical matter, what are those fundamental rights? 10 Commandments, essentially. The top 10, the Bill of Rights.
Bill of Rights.
All right? And you got the Bill of Rights. And included in that Bill of Rights is that right of freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and the right to petition your government for redress of grievances. So you're absolutely right that there could be a snowball effect. And nobody is saying that the government doesn't have a compelling interest. That's the way the Supreme Court calls it. The government has to have, in order to infringe upon a fundamental right, they have to have a compelling interest. Let's assume, let's give the city, the mayor, the governor, for the sake of argument, let's give them the benefit of the doubt that their intentions are pure and that they are out to protect the public and to achieve the fundamental goal of government. Let's assume that's correct for a second. The way you go about doing it is not by just shutting down not all protest. You cannot do a sweeping ban across the board because, as the Supreme Court has explained many times, if the government does have a compelling state interest, the means by which they try to achieve that compelling interest need to be narrowly tailored, and they have to be the least restrictive means possible so that we give that fundamental right breathing room to be able to work. Now, if there's more than 1,000 protests, if there's no ability to maintain proper social distancing, then maybe perhaps the scales of justice have tipped in favor of the government, and they can shut it down, or they can reduce the population or the size of the gathering.
We're talking a large park, right? A large
Absolutely.
park, 20 protesters.
100%.
So in this particular case, that scale would lean more toward your side.
Absolutely.
And in the same breath, and correct me if I'm wrong, and Joe, chime in, if the government's interested in saving lives, and we have lots of gun violence that's occurring, does the government then, maybe under an executive order, say, we're going to go into houses and do searches and try to confiscate guns that may be illegal guns or legal guns? Would that not fall under the same protections of the law?
Absolutely.
That's exactly the same thing, and it's a great analogy to do that because gun violence is very serious.
I mean, let's look at
People
Chicago.
die.
Chicago, the murder rate's skyrocketing. So, you're the mayor of Chicago, the governor of Illinois, I need to decrease the violence. So, we're going to send the police to knock on every door, tell them we need to search for firearms in these apartments. Constitutional protection.
And in
There you go.
2010,
Second Amendment.
and in 2010,
And Fourth Amendment
Yeah,
also, right?
and
Search and
Fourth.
seize.
yeah. I mean, but also in 2010, in the case School City versus McDonald versus City of Chicago, the Supreme Court said they can't do that because the Supreme Court said in the McDonald case that the Second Amendment right, which they had recognized in Heller versus D.C., was a fundamental right. And as a result of that, it was included within those rights that applied against the states through a doctrine that the Supreme Court calls the incorporation doctrine, and they can't do that, absolutely.
So is the mayor's executive order violating constitutional rights of the
Absolutely.
citizens?
But just to go back to what the example Joe was given, as a compelling state interest to protect the people from gun violence, they do have a compelling state interest. But the remedy that the court fixes, it must be narrowly tailored and the least restrictive. So, for example, if you were to ban possession of firearms by convicted violent felons, that would be something that would be rational based, but it's narrowly tailored to accomplish the goal.
Rather than just taking
because
every firearm.
those are the people most likely to commit the gun violence because they're violent felons. So that's the balancing that the court does. Here, what the mayor did, by that pre-recorded message, the significance, that message was not just for that protest. He banned all protests. So he's not even giving the protesters the opportunity to make that balance by wearing masks, by social distancing. He's banned it all.
As a point of clarity, the people that were arrested were not obstructing traffic, were
Nope.
not obstructing sidewalks,
Nope.
were not in violation of any
Nope.
other law.
Nope.
They were purely there to show their displeasure with the mayor's executive order and
Absolutely.
keeping things down.
And that's precisely why they were arrested.
Right.
And therein lies the problem.
Right. And I do know from my sources inside City Hall that the people in City Hall will tell you that the mayor is the one who's ordering these arrests. And from the people in the NYPD, they do not want to do this. And yet, we are enforcing a law or an executive order that is not superseding the Constitution of the United States. And we're continuing to do that. And, we previously had conversations about the enforcement being selective.
Yes.
Some groups are not getting enforcement where other groups are getting enforcement. And this is really creating a Pandora's box. My concern is that we're, taking enforcement upon what I'm going to describe as a minor order. I'm not even so sure it's a law, but somewhere along the line it's going to go bad. And you had touched on this in explaining prior to this incident, we had several incidents that made video and didn't look too good.
Yep.
I brought this up to the police commissioner that we're going to end up with another Eric Gardner case
And for what?
over a minor charge.
Yeah.
That we're going to have total disruption of a city, distrust in the department over someone sitting on a park bench.
The damage that is going to happen, and I'm saying is going to happen because it's already happening with that one officer, is far outweighing the benefit that the
what's
mayor
occurring.
wants to accomplish by this. And it really should be advisory. We've gone away from that, where the government takes the least restrictive means that they can compel you, but makes advisory recommendations. Here's what we advise you don't do, but we're only going to restrict you this far. And that's
Why do you think that both the governor and the mayor are so hardened on this enforcement of social distance, keeping the state closed? is it just about saving lives? I mean, so far, all the data, everything we've heard from everybody has been off. Every death in the city of New York has been corona-related. No one's committed suicide. No one's gotten hit by a bus. What's the purpose of this? Is it just saving lives? Because we're ending up with people who are in depression, alcohol, substance abuse, domestic violence. They can't feed their families. They're out of work. So, the cure may be worse than the virus.
No, absolutely.
So why are we digging in this?
I mean, if you're asking me to put my political science professor hat on,
yeah, do that.
I mean, because I actually do teach political science, but I'll tell you, I mean, I don't think they want this on their watch. I don't think that political leaders want this on their watch. They're seeing the numbers, and they don't want. I mean,
if they don't want this on their watch, why did they not prepare for this? Because New York City has been the number one target for terrorism going back to 9/11.
Yeah,
and Bloomberg apparently had a plan. Commissioner Kelly had a plan, and that plan got changed by Mayor de Blasio, and it got watered down. We closed hospitals. Then all of a sudden we're screaming for hospitals. I think we paid $21 million for a hospital. Maybe it was in Queens that didn't get any patients. The mayor had it all put up. And we didn't get the body count that everybody anticipated. So if you didn't want this to happen, maybe we need to shift the conversation to the accountability as to how it happened. Why did the police not have the equipment needed day one? EMS workers, the doctors and the nurses. Why were we in a panic mode for not having hospital beds?
I think that these are great points, and I've been beating the drum about this. The lack of preparation, as you know, there are plenty of our members still suffering today from not having the proper
on 9/11
protective equipment in 9/11.
Right, thousands have died
and dying because of that. How could we not be better prepared? My daughter worked in a hospital and was told she can only have one mask for a week. One mask for a week. How is that possible in New York after having suffered the damage we suffered on 9/11 and thereafter because of the effects? Is outrageous. And then when you talk about mismanagement, the mayor was more concerned about releasing people from Rikers Island than the people themselves. It shocked me, and it's personal to me because I ran for district attorney, and the closing of Rikers Island was a big issue with me. And I don't understand how, in the way that the president sent the Army Corps of Engineers to convert the Javits Center in 1 week
had 40 patients
to a 1,000-bed COVID hospital. Why couldn't the mayor have asked him, hey, we have a big problem on Rikers Island. We're going to have to release these people unless we can facilitate and accommodate them. There are empty facilities right now on Rikers Island. Send the Army Corps of Engineers there.
Rikers Island is a whole different issue. That's a land grab that's in the midst of occurring. This is about real estate. There was talk about Hart's Island, which is Ward's Island, where Potter's Field is, being used for real estate. So, you don't have to believe us. You'll find out as things develop into the future. You're going to look back and say, I heard that someplace, you heard it here. It's a land grab. Everyone's in bed with it. There's all kinds of deals going on. And that's what Rikers Island's about. We are turning the jails into dollars, and we're turning the streets into the jails. The good people are being incarcerated, and we're now walking the streets amongst the inmates.
Right.
And this is going to be a problem. You're going to get a lot more lawsuits going forward with this. Yeah. What other issue do you see as a major violation of constitutional rights right now?
The other one that really sticks out to me is really near and dear to my heart is the ban on religious worship that was in effect. That also is just
the highest holy holiday for the Catholic religion is Easter Sunday.
Absolutely.
I could have went and bought a bottle of wine within 6 feet, but I couldn't sit in a church pew because they have the churches closed for social
It
distance.
is so offensive.
It doesn't make any
so
sense.
offensive in an American.
Where's the archdiocese on this? Are they suing or?
I take no position on that. I'm not a practicing Catholic. I don't
If
have
I
my
get you a
code.
bunch of Catholics to sue, you'll take the case.
Oh, absolutely.
It's to me, it's just I like we spoke previously about the Hasidic community, they're being shut down.
Oh, yeah.
But you're infringing upon their religious beliefs. At funerals, this is their practice, and to me, it's another constitutional.
Not only
issue.
that, I'll tell you that in talking about funerals, going to a funeral in the Jewish faith, I'm Jewish, okay? Going to a funeral in the Jewish faith is considered one of the highest forms of religious practice and the highest form of service for the simple reason that you're doing a favor for the deceased that he can never repay. By showing respect at a funeral, you are doing something that he's dead, he's gone. He can never repay that. And particularly as it relates to religious leaders, that is considered one of the highest forms of service that you can do. The most purest form of religious
And that was
service you can do.
enforced in Brooklyn.
Absolutely.
And from what I'm told, there were meetings, there were discussions.
Yes.
It just happened to get larger than what was anticipated, but they had barriers, they had mass, and the mayor, he himself showed up to interject in this.
And also, in speaking about the restrictions and sort of dovetailing nicely with our discussion about strict scrutiny, if you go back to some of the original orders that the mayor and the governor issued, in sort of the slowdown, a lot of those orders were pegged to the total occupancy size of the particular facility. So, for example, they were reducing, you had to reduce your total occupancy by 75%. So if your occupancy was 100, you can only have 25 people, right? At least that might have passed the strict scrutiny test, because at least there's an objective standard by which you are measuring the restriction of the right. But, you can't tell me that in a synagogue that's 5,000 square feet, you couldn't have a group of 10 Jewish men coming together for prayer?
I said the same thing about the churches.
You got churches in New York City that are a lot larger than
And
many
most of
these.
them are not packed on any given time. But, you could easily have managed that. I'm sure any one of the priests would have been happy to hold multiple masses to accommodate people.
And I'll tell you something. I was reading the papers of the Berean case. It's a case out of North Carolina. In preparation for my case that I filed, I was looking around the country for for similar cases. So I of course came across the case that it was filed by a Baptist church in North Carolina, and there was a great line in the decision from the judge. He said, "There is no pandemic exception to the First Amendment." And these guys were really serious. And the way the Supreme Court looks at the religion clauses of the First Amendment is, as long as you have a sincerely held religious belief, that's the language of the cases. If you have a sincerely held religious belief, the Supreme Court and courts in general, the federal courts, they're not going to sit there and conduct a litmus test of, are you a believer, are you not a believer, do you really truly? As long as it's a sincerely held religious belief, and just to sort of as a point of example, the Supreme Court has even expanded that to include, for example, atheists who are conscientious objectors to going to serve, and that's going back to the 80s and even before that. So,
There's a section of the Constitution, if I remember correctly, that says Congress shall make no law that supersedes. Am I right?
Yes, the Supremacy Clause, Article 6.
And that impacts religious belief. So does the executive orders, they should not supersede?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yes, that's the basis. That goes back to Marbury versus Madison, in 1803.
As we're talking about, I'm thinking about why hasn't the Archdiocese come forward, and there's also the liability issue. Unless we get the governor's orders struck down, I think by them, I think they may not want to even subject themselves to someone who can say, how the religious practices of receiving the Eucharist and
But there's ways around all that. I can't believe that every church in the state of New York agrees with being closed. Maybe some. Maybe there's some people who don't want to do it. but I can't believe that every church, every priest, and we're talking about a pandemic where people die, where their final rights are now, at the point of death. People want last rights.
Yeah.
This is something that, and I know this was happening, believe it or not, it was being done over, video conference in some cases. So, the need is there, and I got to believe that there are priests that believe that contrary to the idea of being exposed, do they want to be exposed? No. Will they take the chance to carry out their duties? Yes. I believe that they will.
I do.
And at the end of the day, it's not the right of the governor or the mayor to shut down the Catholic churches because the Constitution of the United States, which we have gazillions of people waiting on to get into this country, are willing to live by that.
Right.
And we have two people that just violate the Constitution.
And the interesting thing about that is now that the president has declared that that religious services are essential, okay, that opens up a real, a potential battle on the issue of federalism, states' rights versus the federal government, in which the issue of the supremacy clause of Article 6 of the Constitution is really that might play out. I think that at the end of the day, these restrictions will probably be lifted by the time the Justice Department acts on these things. Either the Civil Rights Division moves in and brings these cases, but absolutely, when you're talking about having state and local executive orders that infringe upon a federally protected right, and then the president has declared that those infringements are essentially unconstitutional and that he plans on enforcing that through his Justice Department, I mean, that's going to be the issue. And you see this issue fought out when it relates to gun licensing and so forth, where the states want to say, well, it's our states' rights. We get to decide how we do it. It's within our quote police powers, as the courts have called it. But at the end of the day, absolutely. I mean, if you have that supremacy clause in there, these rights apply against the states. They've been applied against the states going back for many years, going back to the 30s and 40s. These are the First Amendment, both the religion clauses as well as the free expression clauses were one of the first portions of the Bill of Rights that were incorporated against the states and applied against the states through the 14th Amendment's due process clause. This is going back, to the early 1900s. So, I mean, it certainly applies against the states. It's the supreme law of the land. And the states and the local government need to adhere to the Constitution.
So, Joe, being former NYPD, for all the cops that are watching, that are being put in a position of enforcing laws that ultimately violate people's rights, what advice would you give them?
It's a horrible position you're being put in. I would absolutely love to represent anyone who's being disciplined in any way or adversely treated because of that. But I got to tell you, I mean, that this is a mayor and administration that is so anti-police. Particularly, we didn't even talk about that health commissioner. The way that...
Don't get me started.
Oh, my God. So we're here for you. We support you. Just, use your conscience, use your head, and feel free to call. We're here to help.
Thank you for watching. We'll see you again next week.